Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a huge topic, bridging that gap between writing parallel code and slamming into the hard, physical constraints of GPU hardware. Let's just get right into it.
So, when you look at a modern NVIDIA GPU, you might imagine the streaming multiprocessor, the SM, as this massive, bustling factory floor. And on this floor, there's a staggering theoretical maximum capacity of exactly 2,048 threads. I mean, it sounds like infinite parallelism, right? The promise here is that you can just throw as much work at it as possible, and the hardware is just going to take care of the rest.
But here's the real central conflict. Why can't you actually use them all? Because as a programmer, you're constantly battling this illusion of infinite parallelism. There are actually these invisible walls inside that hardware factory that prevent you from ever realistically hitting that 2,048 thread ceiling.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the hardware ceiling. Second, registers as the hidden bottleneck. Third, shared memory and tiling. Fourth, the P100 versus V100 versus A100. And finally, making smart tuning decisions.
Section 1. The hardware ceiling. Defining the maximum theoretical limits per SM.
So, if we look at the raw numbers straight from the hardware whitepapers, reaching maximum capacity means your configuration has to be absolutely 100% perfect. Every SM groups your threads into warps of 32. It can handle a maximum of 64 of those warps. You multiply those together, and boom, you get our magic ceiling of 2,048 threads per SM. On top of that, you're physically capped at 32 blocks per SM, and no single block can contain more than 1,024 threads. Basically, if you design your kernel perfectly around these exact boundaries, your SM can hit that 100% theoretical capacity. But, as we're about to see, perfection is pretty much never reality.
Section 2. Registers, the hidden bottleneck, or when variables crash your occupancy. Now, before we look at registers, we really need to define the metric we use to measure exactly how much parallelism we're losing when we hit these hidden bottlenecks, and that metric is occupancy. Occupancy is simply the ratio of active warps per SM to the maximum possible warps per SM. So if the hardware limit is 64 warps and your code only allows 32 to run, well, your occupancy is 50%. And that brings us to a crucial point, this stark, hard limit right here, 65,536 32-bit registers per SM. Think of registers as the physical desks that our factory workers, the threads, need to actually do their jobs. You might have the capacity for 2,048 workers, but if there aren't enough desks, they literally can't all work at the same time. And keep in mind, the absolute maximum any single thread can use is 255 registers.
This perfectly illustrates how fast a programmer can burn through this resource. Let's step through the math. Say you configure a block of 256 threads. On the left side, if memory wasn't an issue at all, you could fit 8 blocks perfectly to hit that 64 warp maximum, which gives you 100% theoretical occupancy. But look over at the right side. What if each thread needs 128 registers? Suddenly, a single block demands 32,768 registers. Divide our SM's hard limit of 65,536 by that requirement, and guess what? You can only fit 2 blocks per SM. Your active warps absolutely plummet to 16, and your occupancy crashes to a shocking 25%. You had the threads, you had the blocks, but you just ran out of desks.
Section 3. Shared memory and tiling. Balancing tile size with resident blocks.
Okay, so registers aren't the only workspace threats need. They also rely heavily on shared memory, which dictates how much communal workspace is available for the active blocks on the SM. To set up our next little mathematical realization, let's focus on the modern A100 GPU architecture, which features a hard limit of 164 kilobytes of shared memory per SM.
Imagine your kernel uses a block size of 256 threads, and each block needs 48 kilobytes of shared memory for its data. That 48 kilobytes goes into our 164 kilobyte capacity exactly 3 times, leaving this small 20 kilobyte slice totally unused. Meaning, the SM can only fit 3 blocks inside the A100's limit. 3 blocks of 256 threads equals 768 threads, or 24 warps. So once again, even though the SM is theoretically capable of running 64 warps, the shared memory completely restricts the hardware to just 24.
What you really need to take away from this is a fundamental design implication, the trade-off. Programmers rely on larger tiles in shared memory to improve data reuse and arithmetic intensity. But larger tiles require more shared memory, which actively lowers your occupancy because fewer blocks can fit on the SM at the same time. You absolutely must balance your tile size against the number of concurrent blocks you want running.
Moving to Section 4, P100 versus V100 versus A100, the architectural showdown.
When we bring in some real-world stakes across 3 distinct generations of NVIDIA hardware, a really clear pattern emerges. Notice how the maximum warps per SM stays identical at 64. The maximum threads per SM stays identical at 2048. But look at shared memory. It explodes from a mere 64 kilobytes on the P100 all the way up to 164 kilobytes on the A100. This massive growth completely shifts the optimization battlefield.
These evolving limits give programmers so much more flexibility in that tile size versus resident blocks trade-off we just talked about. If you rely heavily on shared memory, the strict limits of the older P100 might force you to use much smaller tiles just to keep a few blocks resident. But the modern A100, it gives you a choice. You can either use much larger tiles per block to process way more data at once, or you can keep those smaller P100 tile sizes and stack far more blocks per SM, which significantly boosts your occupancy.
Finally, Section 5, Making Smart Tuning Decisions, a mental model for kernel optimization.
Okay, here's a practical 4-step checklist to guide your tuning decisions. Step 1, pick a block size. A great starting point is usually 128 or 256 threads. Just remember to use sizes in multiples of 32 to respect warp sizes and obviously never exceed that 1024 thread block maximum. Step 2, estimate occupancy. Cross-check your threads, warps, and blocks against the 2048, 64, and 32 hard limits. Step 3, adjust registers and shared memory. If your occupancy drops too low because of registers, you'll need to simplify your code. If it drops due to shared memory, try shrinking your tiles. And Step 4, compare across architectures. A kernel that runs flawlessly on a V100 might actually be severely bottlenecked on older hardware.
Now, I really want to warn you about a massive danger here, what I call the small block trap. Let's say you pick a tiny block size of just 32 threads. To hit your 2048 thread ceiling, you'd probably calculate that you need 64 blocks. But wait, the hardware limit is strictly 32 blocks per SM. So you hit the block count limit first, artificially capping your execution at 32 blocks, which is just 32 warps. By picking a block size that's too small, you literally cap your hardware at 50% of its maximum potential.
So the bottom line is that those staggering numbers on an NVIDIA spec sheet, they're just a ceiling, definitely not a guarantee. Your kernel's actual resource consumption, meaning its registers, its shared memory, its block sizing, that is what actually dictates the real execution limits you're going to achieve.
And this brings us right to our final, absolutely critical takeaway today: evaluate GPUs holistically. Never look at one metric in a vacuum. An occupancy bottleneck caused by registers on a P100 might suddenly turn into a shared memory bottleneck on an A100. Every single constraint is interconnected.
Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this structured look at the hardware really helps you see the invisible walls behind the illusion of infinite parallelism. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought as you dive back into your code. What physical limits will shape your next kernel?